Creator and sustainer of all things and all people, you are the source of all wisdom and light. Enlighten our minds to receive your guidance, so that you may lead us into true wisdom. May all that we say and do in the service of this county, whether as elected member or as officer, be in accordance with your will and for the good of your people. Amen. Evacuation procedure. In the event of having to evacuate the council chamber, would everyone leave by one of the two exits at the rear of the chamber? Officers will be on hand to assist any people with disabilities. Mobile phones. May I ask all members who have mobile phones with them to ensure that they are switched off so that they will not disturb this meeting. Chairman's announcements. Mr. Rob Fraser and Mr. Colin Chapman. It is with sadness that I report the death of former county councillors Rob Fraser and Mr. Colin Chapman. Mr. Fraser was a member of the County Council from 1993 to 2013 and represented the ward I represent, Groby and Ratby electoral division. Mr. Fraser was a member of the Cabinet between 2003 and 2004. He was also a former chairman of the Development Control and Regulatory Board and of the Environment Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Mr. Chapman was a member of the County Council from 1993 to 1997, representing the Melton Mowbray North electoral division. Mr. Chapman served mainly on the Education Committee, Environment Committee and Economic Development and Community Initiatives Committee. I invite the Council to stand in silent tribute to the memory of Mr. Fraser and Mr. Chapman. Mr. Old, County Councillor. I am sure all members would like and join me in congratulating Ivan Old, our Cabinet Lead Member for Children and Families, who was awarded an OBE in the Queen's New Year's Honours List. Ivan has been the lead member for schools and children's services since 1999. He is one of the longest serving in the country and is the most deserving of this award. Well done, Ivan. Apprenticeships. I am pleased to report that recently published data in the percent of employees that are apprenticeships shows that we are the second highest of all two-tier county councils at 2.2%, following a significant increase over the previous year. In this regard, it is also pleasing to note that following work trials of 5 of our looked-after children, 4 have now successfully progressed and been taken on apprenticeships. The 5th was offered an apprenticeship but decided to pursue another option. Visitors, I welcome to the meeting all visitors and guests and members, and of course anyone who is joining on the webcast today. Agenda item number 2, minutes of the previous meeting, pages 3 to 18. I move that the minutes of the meeting of the Council held on the 5th of December 2018, copies of which have been circulated to members, be taken, read, confirmed and signed. Thank you, Mr. Licorice. All in favour? Thank you. Agenda item number 3, declarations of interest. I invite members who wish to do so to make declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda for this meeting. I'm assuming that all members who are members of district and parish councils will wish to declare their personal interest in relation to the medium-term financial strategy 2019-20, 22-23. Are there any other declarations? Councillor Payne.
Many thanks, Chairman. I'd like to declare a personal interest in relation to passenger transportation issues referred to in the medium-term financial strategy. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Any further? Thank you. Noted. Questions asked under Standing Order 7.1, 2 and 5. The questions and replies set out in the order paper will be taken as read and entered into the minutes. I've received notice of the supplementary questions and will now call upon the relevant members to put them. Councillor Bray.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. And I'd like to thank the lead member for his reply, well, both his replies, but the supplementary relates to the second of our 2 questions. Naturally, I won't be surprised to say that I find the reply disappointing. Since I tabled the question, I've also received a letter from Tom, a Year 5 pupil on the school council, explaining the dangers that he and his friends face every day going to this school, and he's invited me to come along to the school council and attend one of their meetings. I just wondered whether the lead member would be willing to join me in an explaining...
Could you ask the question?
Yeah, will he join me in that meeting with the school council to explain the county council's decision?
Councillor Payne? I'm told it's not a supplementary question, Mr. Bray.
Take that as a no then.
But Mr. Payne would like to reply.
Chairman, I won't answer whatever supplementary it's supposed to be, but I'd be happy to join Mr. Bray at the school meeting, time permitting, and if we can make sure the diaries can be arranged as such and explain to the Year 5 pupil. By the way, we are aware of the Year 5 pupil writing into the department, and that Year 5 pupil will get a full response, as we do with all our residents and constituents. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Mr. Hunt, you have a supplementary question, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I couldn't find very much clarity or to put a supplementary question until I got to number 8, which was a bit of a bolt of lightning in an otherwise bland and possibly computer-generated report. It refers to the active travel schools officer, who is apparently working with 9,800 primary-age children, and I'd like to know how many of them are working in, well, how many children in Loughborough are engaged in this, and how we can actually access the services of the active travel schools officer, who I've heard nothing about up till now.
Mr. Payne.
Chairman, thank you, and thank you, Max, for your rather lengthy question in 9 parts. Again, it's a little bit confusing as to what part I should be speaking to, but if we're if we're referring to the travel plans and the Mode Shift Stars accreditation scheme, I just want to point out that in 2010-11, the government pulled funding for school travel plan officers, and we've since come to arrangements with what we call SPANs, which are the school physical activity officers that actually are in the district and borough councils that go in as part of their programme and encourage people to be more, children to be more active when travelling to school. In terms of how many students in the Loughborough area, are being looked after by these spans, I'll have to refer back to the department and get a written response to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Payne. Agenda item 5, to receive position statements from members of the Cabinet. The position statement by the Leader, please. Mr Rushton.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I have circulated it in the time-old tradition. I won't read it verbatim, apart from under local government finance, which obviously we're talking about at great length in a little while. Can I place on record my thanks to Chris Tambini and his team down in Byron's department. The work they do on analysing data and feeding in evidence to the CCN, the LGA and to Rishi Sunak is recognised by senior officers and senior members down in London. So I want to place on record my thanks to them, because I think they go beyond the call of duty, and the work they produce is excellent. So we're doing well with it, as it says here, but we're obviously still worried about adult social care and children's social care and the formula that comes out of it. Because obviously, as everybody knows, that's 60-odd% of our budget. The proposal for business rates retention is important at 75%, but more fiscal reform is needed so that properly resourced county councils can grow their local economies in a we've got to mention it already, in a post-Brexit landscape. So that is important work for us going forward. But I think we are making headway, and hopefully in the next, let's say, year, we might have some good news. On the meetings with head teachers, members be aware we're currently consulting on the development of the provision for children with special educational needs and disabilities across Leicestershire. It says it's an ambitious programme. It certainly is ambitious and will take up a lot of time, but it is important that we do it. Last, at the Scrutiny Commission, I happened to mention off-rolling or other expressions which are used, and it did cause a little bit of consternation among some of the Leicestershire head teachers. I wasn't particularly picking on them. It was just that the day before I'd been at the LGA on the LGA executive, and it is a big issue countrywide. So when I realised it had caused some consternation, I did get the two head teachers in, explain to them that I wasn't particularly getting at Leicestershire in itself. It was just that it is an issue nationally, and they were reassured by my comments. I do thank them for the work they do. I also had the same conversation with the Bishop, who was particularly keen to tell me that the church schools make more effort than some of the other schools, and I was able to reassure him as well. Going on to Towton and the Local Development Corporation, this is a big thing that the government has given to Leicestershire, the power station and Towton, and it's being driven by the Chancellor. So things that are driven by the Chancellor are very important, and Sir John will be the chairman of it, who I get on well with, as you know. So the first thing he's going to do is develop this oversight board. Now, the oversight board will have a whole plethora of people on it to make sure it engages with the public and with various councils, because if you take the whole area, there's lots and lots of councils and people involved. So I've been invited to go onto the oversight board, same as North West Leicestershire leader will, and maybe even Charnwood leader. But the secret to it is to try and get myself onto the actual development corporation. And when Sir John talks about it in private, he talks about it being akin to the Docklands Development Corporation. So we need, if I can, I'll try my best to get on, but there's going to be a lot of people competing for very few local government positions on this, because it will be set up very similar to a LEP. They'll want the majority of people on there to be businesses and senior businesses. So the people, say, who own the old power station, who've developed their future for what they want to do with that 700-odd acre site, they would almost certainly be on. So there won't be a lot of room for local authority leaders, but rest assured I'll try and get myself on, because it is incredibly important to Leicestershire what goes on with our airport, and of course what goes on with the power station just across the border will have a massive effect again on North West Leicestershire and Charnwood Borough. So I shall do my best with that. Here's some stuff now about the Transport for the East Midlands Regional Summit, Infrastructure Summit, which I went to. Byron chaired Cabinet for me because I went there. I thought it was good. I thought Sir Peter put on a good effort with it. It's in a nice room, in the old Willie Hall snooker room, so it's a nice room. People can hear and see what's going on. I thought it was well run. People were speaking with one voice, which is incredibly important, especially when the East Midlands is battling against the West Midlands. So we need to all speak as one voice and make sure we commit ourselves to Midlands Engine, Midlands Connect, and generally be there to support our region. I noticed there was I think Terry was there, and I think Simon came along, so we were all there listening to it, and I thought it was pretty good. The most interesting person who isn't talking particularly about roads and that was a chap called Shami Raikura, who is the regional, who's the Uber lead for cities. Now, he was very, very good, and I went and had a chat with him afterwards, and he's going to come in and see myself and Blake to talk about the future of transportation in Leicestershire and in the country in general. Now, if he says something interesting, I said to the chief earlier on, we'll try and put on a members briefing so you can all hear what he's saying, because it is quantum leaps in how we're going to move around. You know, the days are going when there'll be dirty old buses crawling through villages, belching out smoke with one person on it. The days are coming when you're going to have pods, self-driving cars, and Ubers, where you don't just jump in an Uber like I do in London now and go to a destination, always in a Prius as it happens, but you're the only person in there. What they're trying to develop is other Ubers where people don't mind sharing, because why people stay in their cars, according to him, is they like their own personal space. That's why they often won't go on buses. They like public transport, but they don't like the other public. So if you can develop something that people like in an Uber-type technology, and Uber won't be the only people doing it, but I thought he was a really, really good guy. He happens to have been born in Leicester, which was a good start. So he's going to come in and see me and Blake, and as I said, if it's something interesting, I'll ask the chief to put on a member briefing thing like we did yesterday, where we got 26 turn up, I think, to talk about the strategic growth plan, which was a good turnout. Normal stuff about meeting MPs. This one's quite good. I've managed to get to see Sir Alan. He's the busiest member of Parliament we've got. So we go up to see him, and I went up to see him. Byron came along, the chief came along, a whole bunch of transport people came along to talk about the relief road, strategic growth plan, and all that sort of stuff. And it was good of him to see us, because we had to go and see him, because an hour later he was being driven down to London to fly to Canada to try to sort out the crisis in Venezuela. So it was good to catch up with him. He's a senior member of Parliament, and it's very important that we remain friends with him. I've been trying to get the meetings back together, as I say here, with Bishop Martin. We did go and see him. It was a good meeting. We discussed church, the cathedral. We discussed academy trusts, where sometimes the church won't let non-church schools into their multi-trust academies, or MATs, whatever they're called, which he says isn't true. So we've had a nice email back from him saying that he will. And then the other bit here, which I'm sure not many of us know about, it's not particularly a county council matter, but if you ever have anyone come to stay in Leicestershire, go and have a look at St Martin's Lodge, which is built overlooking the cathedral. It really, really is good. You know, it's akin to a 5-star hotel, but it doesn't provide service. So you go and collect your key across the road where the cafe is. You go in the front door, and there's all these beautifully renovated rooms, and you just come and go. So you can't phone up and get a gin and tonic or a cup of tea, but it's right opposite the cathedral. It's got a good car park at the back, really good access into the city centre, and it's not cheap, don't get me wrong, but it's not massively expensive. I was just wanted to place it on the record, so if people do watch us on the internet and they're wanting to stay in Leicester, I'd say go and stay with the Bishop. That concludes, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Mr Galton, please.
Yes, thank you, Chairman, and thank you very much, the Leader, for his statement. As he says, we're really going to cover the local government finance settlement in a bit more detail when we do the MTFS. But he did refer to members of Parliament, and I would just like to, having watched, as some sad ones of us do, watch that debate in Parliament on the local government settlement, actually how few members, Leicestershire members of Parliament were there. Now, Sir Alan, you have to forgive, because he's a minister, and as you've explained. But the only other one I saw there could have been some lurking at the back, was Mr O'Brien from Harborough. And I think that does highlight the concerns that he and Mr Rhodes have been making. Is we do need to see the evidence of this support for better funding for Leicestershire. But I'm sure we'll pick that up. Now, on the local development corporation, I hope we do get some representation on this Quango, on this development corporation. The leader didn't say, and I don't know whether that's because it's not clear yet, whether it's going to have planning powers that affect Leicestershire. What I'd heard is there's a chance that it will have planning powers, but we're not sure whether it will actually affect North West Leicestershire. But this has to have implications for the strategic growth plan that we've only recently just seen fit to agree. And when you looked at that, the massive area of the power station that they put up at the Regional Transport Summit, you have to understand how big and how huge this is going to be. And it will have knock-on effects, particularly if it's going to provide all this employment, where these people are going to live, where they're going to commute to. So I think the strategic growth plan's pretty silent on this. It doesn't really address it. Now, okay, it came along late in the day, but we're not very joined up at the moment, and I can see this development corporation going off down a route that may well be very different from the strategy that we have agreed to sign up to at this stage. So that's why we do need representation. And then on the meeting with Leicestershire MPs, yeah, I just wonder how the relationship with Sir Alan is going after his comments previously about something unpleasant happening to the leader. And you know, you raised the Melton bypass and the strategic growth plan. Did you raise unitary status? Because Sir Alan has some views about that, which many of us actually probably share, and some of us would agree and share with. So I don't know. It would have been nice to have been a fly on the wall, Chairman, and know if the two senior people in Leicestershire discussed that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Galton. Dr Ryan, please.
Chair, and I thank the leader for his report. And I'm pleased to see that he agrees with our side that more fiscal reform is needed in local government finance, and I do hope that we will see more of a focus on prevention, deprivation and social care. I have some sympathy with the leader over his meeting with the heads. I've been called up before the heads before now for making the odd critical comment, and I'm glad that it was a productive discussion. I remain concerned about the rising numbers, as I understand it, of children being homeschooled, not because their parents are ideologically committed to homeschooling, but because they have a child with special educational needs who they feel those needs will not be met in our schools. And I know that this is a concern not just on our side of this chamber. Pleased to hear about the Development Corporation, and I also attended the Infrastructure Summit, as the leader mentioned. And of course, for business, infrastructure is workers. You've got to get the workers there. And when Uber turned up, being a bit of a lefty and their reputation with their workers, I wasn't exactly minded to listen, but my goodness, what a presentation. I would be very keen to see that here. The technology could be a real help to us. We are facing a climate emergency. Well, no, lots of us aren't facing up to a climate emergency. We're still buying our gas-guzzling cars and leaving them on our drive 95% of the time. I think it was a very inspiring session and perhaps something that we can take on here. Yes, it was very nice of the leader to give us an advert for the St Martin's Lodge. At this point, I think I'll just give an advert for some. We've got some great campsites in North West Leicestershire.
Thank you, Dr Ryan. Mr Bill, please.
On the question of the discussion with the school's heads, I would hope that the discussion did touch on the question of underfunding, because this is a very serious matter, and some of our senior schools in particular are facing a crisis situation. But I wonder if I could talk once again about the Transport for the East Midlands issue. I see there we're speaking with one voice. I tend to be speaking with one voice on this subject. which is not the same voice as that of most of the authorities. And I do apologise in advance to Amanda and Maggie, because I might be straying into their territories on this. But I have to say once again that there is considerable concern in Hinckley over what looks as if what is being planned by the developers, by the planners, by the regional authorities, and possibly by the government, what is being planned for our neck of the woods. And I shan't go on about this again this afternoon, but I have to reiterate this, because if we don't say it when we have the opportunity, we're always accused then of not having said it when we had the opportunity. But the massive overdevelopment around Junction 2 of the M69, which is currently open countryside, will have a devastating impact. Will have a devastating impact on the communities affected, the countryside, Burbage Common, the farms and the fields, because so much of that will be gone. I did raise this at the Scrutiny Commission in December when plans first came available, and I've been pursuing it ever since. I would very much like to see the new housing infrastructure bid before it is submitted on March the 1st, because I want to be reassured that it will no longer contain the massive industrialisation of that land which lies between Burbage, Aston Flamville, Stony Stanton and Sapgate. I pass those places every time I come here, and I look across to the fields, whether I'm on the train or in the car, and I just wonder how much longer these fields are going to be with us. This is a serious matter. I have tried to address it over and over again at this level, at regional level, and at any other level I can find, because I think people have to wake up to the fact that the countryside that we currently enjoy in southwest Leicestershire will be gone forever if these plans come to fruition.
Thank you, Mr. Bill. Mr. Old.
Thank you, Chairman, and can I thank you for the congratulations that you gave and the endorsement from colleagues around the chamber. That was very well given. Thank you. I want to comment on the head teachers meeting that I was at with the leader, and I would first of all point to the excellent relationships that we had with the head teachers. We had the representatives for the secondary heads and the primary heads present, and they were just seeking clarification. Nationally, we know from people like the Children's Commissioner that there is a rise in home education, that there appears to be in some authorities almost uncontrolled off-rolling. That is not the case in Leicestershire, where our inclusion partnerships work to avoid anybody being excluded from school. But there can sometimes be a mismatch between what a school can offer and what a parent actually expects, and where social media can be used to give very unrealistic aspirations of almost an attitude of entitlement. It was a very positive meeting, and I want to commend the head teachers for raising the subject and coming and meeting with us. We work so closely with our schools in the county, academies as well as maintained, that the SEN proposals, which are included in the medium-term financial statement and are currently out for consultation, actually depend. There is an assumption in there that the schools wish to engage. That assumption has been made because the heads and the chairs of academy trusts have also articulated that fact, that they want to engage on this expansion agenda so that we get local education for children with special needs instead of having to shift them outside the county and across the county. On the issue of self-drive cars, I can only hope that the rate of acceleration of driverless cars increases. The division that I represent is characterised by elderly people no longer able to drive, who find it difficult to walk 200 metres to the local bus stop, let alone in some cases 2 to 3 miles. You can't run buses with a single passenger. If you actually work out an average is the outcome of a range, and the range can be very high. to very low if the bus is well populated. I look forward to the day when elderly people can tap in their requirements and the car arrives and they can be taken to the doctor, taken to the shops, come back, put in another set of coordinates and the car goes back to its depot. That, to me, is the way forward to avoid rural isolation. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr Auld. No further questions? Mr Rushton, please.
Thank you, Chairman. With regards to members of Parliament that were in the House at question time today, I didn't go in for lunch because I was watching it, and I actually saw Sir David Tredinnick ask the question. Andrew Bridgen was sitting in front of him, and I definitely saw Neil O'Brien in there. But as you know, it's not big enough to hold everyone anyway, and if I was a Member of Parliament, I think I could find plenty of better things to do than go in there for what I find just a bit of a show and tell, if I'm honest. So I don't want to criticise Members of Parliament for not being there, especially people like Sir Alan who've probably got other things to do. But I certainly saw three, Simon, including Sir David Tredinnick, who, as you know, is now no longer seeking re-election at the next election. On the Development Corporation, it would be nice if it had planning powers, but nobody's told me yet. I mean, obviously the Lowland Docklands Corporation had planning powers, and it would be difficult. Maybe it would have strategic powers and design things, and how roads and things are laid out would still go to districts. I honestly don't know. Strategic growth plan, obviously the next iteration of it, and they are produced quite regularly, will have to take account of whatever goes there, but it can't possibly predict what's going there, and I don't think the power station itself closes till 2025. And you're right there, it is a huge site. It's 750 acres, all the services are in, the electricity's in. There is massive potential there, and it will have an effect on our boundary. With regards to Sir Alan, I have a great relationship with him. You know, just because at one time he said something nasty to me, I don't take offence. You know, I like him. He's a nice guy. My son goes to see him in London, and he's been helping him with some things he's doing down there. So you know, I can't say any more about him. I personally kind of like him and thank him for hosting my son in the Foreign Office, which he likes to go into because apparently it's a very, very nice office. Terry, fiscal reform on prevention, obviously we're entirely with you. Hopefully Matt Hancock, the new Secretary of State for Health, I think he's more inclined to give money to prevention, which will help us. In the past, I think to a certain extent, it's been the National Hospital Service, and it should certainly spend more money on prevention, because over the last 15, 20 years, prevention's gone down and down and down, and building hospitals has gone up and up and up. So I've got great faith in Matt Hancock. I think he speaks nicely, he looks the part, and he's not a normal, boring Tory MP in there. So I think he could be good. I think he's got a future ahead of him. And of course, you're right about Uber and air quality. It's something which in the cities is more of a problem. But I thought it was interesting, that story he gave us about in a city in America, where instead of the big corporation coming down, and instead of saying to them, well, you've got to have 600 space car park, they gave every employee a £100 Uber voucher and said, you can't come to work in your car because we're not going to provide the car park. We're going to make you go in Uber. And if they use one voucher for themselves, that's one gone. But if they share it with 3 people, it's only a third of one gone. And that's again another thing to try and encourage people to change how they travel around. And he's very, very, as you know, in London, nearly every Uber you get into is a Prius. I mean, ultimately, we don't want them to be Prius because they still have a petrol engine in there. We want them to be electric, but we certainly want to get rid of diesels. Even the new diesels are still pretty dirty vehicles, and the city struggles a lot more than, say, we do in the countryside. David, thank goodness you mentioned your same old thing, junction 2 of the M69. Don't forget, David, all applications down there aren't made by us. They're not made by Blaby, they're not made by Hinkley Bosworth. They're made by individual companies. And the big ones will not even be determined by us, by Blaby or Hinkley Bosworth. They'll be determined by the National Planning Infrastructure Committee, whatever it is. Hinkley Bosworth and certainly Blaby will be key consultees within that, and that's how we will input into it. Same happened to me up in Northwest at Rocks Hill, which is right against my division. I was consulted, but we didn't determine it. It was determined nationally. And as for HIF bids, David, you're actually legally not allowed to see them. That's why you can't. I haven't seen it. And I understand that you've been written to and explained that individual members are not allowed to see HIF bids. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Rushton. All right, move on to consider reports of Cabinet. Agenda item number 6, report of the Cabinet. Mr Rhodes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Chairman. This is the 10th austerity budget, and it's my 7th as lead member for Finance and Resources. And to date, we have delivered £200 million in savings since 2010-11. But by the end of this MTFS, which now goes further 4 years, that figure will be approaching 300 million. It actually adds up to 270. Our 4-year plan shows that pressure is building on both our revenue and capital budgets, and our social care and special educational needs and disabilities, or SEND services in particular. And with a comprehensive spending review on local government funding reform proposals not due until the late this year, 2019, there is much uncertainty. Councils are starting 2019 in a much better shape than could have been hoped for several months ago, because the government made a series of interventions and to provide some modest new resources. So whilst new resources are welcome, it's disappointing that they're for a limited time period. What we need is a long-term funded solution to the ongoing demographic and cost pressures. Additional demand for social care and special educational needs and disabilities support, combined with inflation, is driving up costs by 94 million. £50 million of service demands and 44 million of inflation, covering increases in supplier charges and pay rises. We can balance our books for the next 2 years. How many councils can say that with surety? But then shortfalls arise, which will require £20 million of annual savings or new income. Well, Leicestershire faces the same challenges as the rest of the country. Being a low-funded authority means we have a low margin for error and must continue the approach that has served us so well to date. Next year, the local government funding system will come into operation. That will bring in fair funding and further devolution of business rates. Some people think that will bring much more funding to councils. Indeed, it may, but it may not. So local government remains an unprotected sector, and the increase in expenditure of the NHS may place additional demands on other sectors. So local government may continue to feel the pressure of spending reductions. And to ensure that we have a sensible MTFS, we've assumed that the funding reductions for Leicestershire will continue year on year at the current rate. However, fair funding should bring about a better allocation for county councils in general, and Leicestershire in particular. This is not in the forecast, but will be welcomed if indeed it comes. Let me just turn to a few of the savings. Over the next 4 years, the county council will need to save 75 million, of which 20 million still needs to be identified as part of a range of initiatives. This is not going to be easy. Some of the savings will be difficult technically to achieve. For example, the significant increase in internal foster care provision and the efficiency and productivity programme, £8 million, will require areas that have been looked at before to be revisited. Now, on the growth side, demand's increasing as are costs. We need to make savings as resources are simply not keeping up. The MTFS includes inflation of 44 million, with a significant proportion for the national living wage. And the growth of 50 million, with the majority going to social care. It's predicted there will be 600 children in the council's care by March 2019, an increase of 13% over the last 12 months. Adult social care pressures are lower than recent history, but still significant. By 2037, the number of over 80s is set to double, and Leicestershire's population is expected to grow by 13%. Currently, we support just over 3,700 children with SEND, 32% more than in 2013, in line with the national picture. and demand for SEND support is forecast to rise by 22% over the next 5 years. If we take no action, there will be a shortfall of over £40 million by 2023 cumulative cash, but we are taking action. On the resources side, it's proposed that the council tax rises by 3.99%, generating an additional £12 million per year, primarily to be invested in supporting vulnerable people. £5 million of that is to support the rise in people requiring adult social care and their increasing needs. £6 million to support the growing number of children in care and increased assessments and transport requirements relating to SEND support, and a further £1 million to improve transitions between children and adult social care and projects to ensure Leicestershire gets the most out of HS2 if it comes about, and to deal with things like ash dieback. 3.99% increase is the county's share of a Band D bill by around £50 a year from April 2019, and this is equivalent to just over £4 a month or £1 a week. Public consultation shows that 45% are broadly in favour of a rise of that sort of magnitude. It might be worthwhile pointing out that a Band D property owner in Westminster will pay £710. In Leicestershire, it's going to be £1,722, which of course results from the fact that money is being provided for London but not for Leicestershire. The national funding reform remains key to the Council's future sustainability. The current outdated system is broken. Leicestershire is the lowest funded county area. If we were funded at the same level as Camden, we'd receive an extra £330 million a year. Now, the county received £56 million in revenue support grant in 2015-16, and it will get nothing this year, 2019-20. The business rate retention consultation that accompanied the fair funding consultation confirmed the government's intention to remove council's share of accumulated growth in 2021. This equates to £3 million for the county council and £8 million for the LEP. Leicestershire has been chosen as one of just 15 areas to pilot a new approach to business rates, unlocking £14 million more for the county and city. The county's share of that is £6.6 million to invest in initiatives to improve financial sustainability and contribute towards the infrastructure funding challenge. The focus of financial sustainability investment will be children's social care, for example, areas identified by the Innovation Partner in the Children and Families Services. Just turning briefly to capital, the capital programme totals £398 million over the 4 years, 2019 to 23, including £140 million in this next year, 2019-20. This is the County Council's largest ever year programme. It's all been achieved without borrowing. Mr Shepherd, who will be seconding the motion I'm just about to propose, will tell you more about the capital and also about Treasury management. So, Mr Chairman, I move the motion on the order paper, items A to P, and I look forward to everyone in the Council chamber voting for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Rhodes. Mr Shepherd, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I second the motion. And as Byron mentioned, I'd like to cover things like the capital programme and Treasury management. Now, as we all know, hidden away, or in those rather dry abstract words, capital programme, are real things of benefit to our county. Roads, schools, places to work, rural broadband. In this chamber over the past few years, we made some very unpleasant decisions which we wouldn't have wanted to make, I'm sure. But we can at least acknowledge, as Byron has said, we are better placed now, luckily, than many other councils. No, not luckily, thanks to the hard work, actually, of Byron and the officer team. Not luck at all, it's hard work. And this capital programme is something of real significance, a massive programme, as Byron has said. Taking some particular figures then, to give some detail. I mentioned roads and highways. There's £159 million there for infrastructure. there's a proactive approach to external bidding and investment design work paying off. There's £132 million of external funding secured for a range of schemes for our county network. That approach is being continued with £7 million earmarked for advanced design work to make sure our future bids, and we have to bid, of course, our future bids have the best chance of success. It's a competitive process. Then the schools, £99 million for schools. Most of that, £65 million, will be invested in new places to meet the demand in our growing county with a growing population. Investment in SEND, of course, supporting delivery of better outcomes with more local and lower cost provision. Some more detail, some more figures. I mentioned places to work, new workplaces and industrial units. Investment of £67 million in that, supporting the local economy, but also, of course, bringing down the county council's need to make savings by giving us a reliable income stream. It works in both ways. And then rural broadband. Often people call that, you know, the new highway. £11 million for rural broadband, which will take coverage beyond that critical 97% coverage to further properties. Turning now, if I may, to Treasury management. And there was a bit of a kerfuffle in the media last year about the County Council's loan to Northamptonshire. Some of our friends across there, and maybe even across here, expressed some anxiety on our behalf that this really would all go terribly wrong and we wouldn't get the money back. Mr. Bolter, I see, is nodding. I mean, he was, I'm sure, one of the kerfuffle's authors. But, you know, I think, as Mr. Bolter, being an experienced councillor, ought to have known, actually, loans to councils, even Northamptonshire, are really pretty secure. I'll just give some examples of that. A council actually can't be declared insolvent. It's created by statute. And loans are secured on the authority's revenues, in other words, council tax by law. And of course, as we know, of course, a council is required by law to set a balanced budget. And so, as we know, again, it's our duty to get the best we can in terms of a return, interest from money invested for the benefit of local people. And there was some interest returned. I mean, interest rates, of course, are very low these days, but there was £37.5 million, which it was, £1,000 returned by way of interest. The money came back on time. And we thank Corporate Governance Committee colleagues for their oversight of our management approach to Treasury matters, and they've made no comment, I believe, on the approach to local authorities. So I join with Byron in commending this budget to you, and I do invite you to support it, despite your perhaps reservations about the national picture. It is actually something good in these circumstances for our county, our residents.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherd. I've Mr. Galton first. I've got about 6 or 7 speakers, so if you wish to speak, let me know, please. And thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I rise to reply to the budget that's been moved by the administration. And in the last national budget, of course, we were told that austerity had ended and we could look forward to public spending increasing and investment in services. Of course, what the Chancellor didn't say was that this didn't apply to local government. More cuts are coming, and this is set to continue. Is there any end in sight? It appears not, on the basis of recent statements by the Institute for Financial Studies and other commentators and financial experts. And the few days after the budget was published, the IFS put out a paper, and they said some really important things in that. Firstly, that the settlement shows that funding from local taxes available in the new system is unlikely to keep pace with the rising spending pressures in coming years, and that additional sources of funding are going to be needed. And then later they say, what is clear, what is coming out of this, is that revenues and business rates and council tax alone will not keep pace with the rising costs and demands for services. There's some quite serious warnings there. Now, we acknowledge that there is no significant new service reductions in this budget during the next 12 months. Previously approved savings and cuts will bite, however, as they are implemented, and the impacts are felt by some of the most vulnerable people who rely on the services provided by this council. I refer in particular to special needs transport, supported bus services, and the closure of children's centres. We know that although the budget is balanced for the next 2 years, there are £20 million of savings yet to be identified and made in years 3 or 4. Now, the Conservatives agree there is a problem. Mr Rose has acknowledged it today. A serious budget shortfall. And yet their plan appears to be to keep fingers crossed and hope government will be more generous to Leicestershire in the next local government settlement. Mr Chairman, where is the evidence for this optimism? What is clear is that there is a huge transfer taking place in the way local government services are funded from revenue grant provided by the government to the council taxpayer. Mr Chairman, this is the first year since I've been a member of this council, in 1989, that the council has received zero revenue support grant from central government to support our services. As was confirmed at the Scrutiny Commission, this is unlikely to change, and the council will now be dependent on income from council tax business rates, charging people for services and commercial investments such as the Citroën garage in Leicester we recently purchased. There was a time, not many years ago, when a council tax rise of 4%, more if you consider the total council tax bill residents will be receiving in a few weeks. We'll just remind members, the police are in a similar position. You need to take into account a £24 rise on a Band D property that they're having to make in order to put some more police officers back on our streets. Would have been totally unacceptable to colleagues on that side of the chamber only a few years ago. What is proposed today passes an increasing share of the funding requirement for council services onto the local taxpayer. And my concern is that this shift is being done by stealth, year on year, without any consultation and without any public policy announcement. Just the annual local government settlement made by the Secretary of State, which usually doesn't get much attention. Now, I see Mr Rushton has started tweeting again after some absence. And my attention was drawn to Whittick Matters that he tweeted the other day, which appears to be a Conservative publication. The heading was Whittick Conservatives Lower Your Council Tax. It went on to explain that the Conservative councillors had successfully reduced the council tax bill despite a Labour attempt to block it. Well, I was quite puzzled by this, Mr Chairman, bearing in mind the debate today and the 4% council tax increase being proposed, but I read on and it became clear that it was referring to only the parish precept. No mention of the proposed county council increase set to be agreed here this afternoon, which of course accounts for 80% of the bill. In my experience, the public tends to see through these kind of claims, and the people who make these claims and do something at one council and then do the opposite at another tend to get caught out. Now, I want to just focus on a couple of issues in closing. Supported bus services, which that's going to come in this year. We had a consultation. The majority of people said they were opposed to the new policy. People pleaded not to take their only public transport link away that serves their community. They told us they didn't want a DRT, that they have to ring up to book in advance. They wanted a proper scheduled bus service. The response to this was, I found, rather patronising. People don't really understand how DRT works. We need to do more to explain it to them. One member said he thought DRT was great, and it meant we didn't have to have people going around on empty buses. I would ask members to look at some of the passenger numbers on some of the routes we are currently subsidising. Many of them are not riding empty. They are providing a much-needed public service, and I thought that's what we were here to do. Mr Payne, as lead member, certainly knows the concern about some of the bus routes which are on the red and amber lists currently being worked up in the department and assessed for their future as we sit here and discuss the budget today. Like me, he's received passionate emails from people that depend on their local bus services, including routes in his own backyard in Harborough. He says no decisions have yet been made, but the Cabinet has approved a policy which condemns many of these routes to history if the budget before us is allowed to continue unchanged today. And that is why, Mr Chairman, later the Liberal Democrat group will move an amendment which seeks to restore that funding. Now, the final point I wanted to make, because I think it's quite topical at the moment with concerns, and it's still a personal regret to me. One of the first things we did when we embarked on austerity and cuts was dismantle the youth service. Everybody involved in youth work and working with young people to provide support and guidance in those vital teenage years will tell you that the youth services can make a real difference to their lives and them getting on in society and not becoming involved in crime and antisocial behaviour. It's classic preventive work which pays dividends in the long term and justifies investment in those services. This council had one of the best youth services in the country, but as I say, it's one of the first to be dismantled in response to the cuts. I think in future years, particularly if we do manage to get any additional funding, and I don't share the confidence that some have, but that has to be a candidate to put back some sort of youth service in Leicestershire that we can once again be proud of. Thank you very much, Mr Chairman.
Thank you, Mr Galton. I've got 11 further speakers, so I shall draw a line after Mr Payne now. Dr Enyon, please.
And I thank Councillor Rhodes and Councillor Shepherd for their report, and also Councillor Galton for his excellent critique. As an opposition leader, my job is to look at this budget and say what's wrong with it, so that my group do not have to sully their hands by voting for it. So what is wrong with this budget? Well, there's nothing new in it. It's a graveyard of battles fought and lost. We've heard of some of them: for Sure Start centres, for special educational needs transport, for bus subsidies, though it looks like that corpse is about to be revived. What does it show us coming over the horizon? Growth Line 6, which shows us the cost of meeting the needs of older people will increase year on year, from 1.9 million to 5 million. Is the problem with this budget what we don't see in it? Last year there was a savings line, AC14, which was to review low-level service provision for 2,600 people and encourage them to ask their families or their friends or the voluntary sector or anybody else but us to deal with their care. And we now have instead AC10, where we have a cut of 1.7 million year on year, and this seems to be hidden under sort of Orwellian language, a target operating model, demand management improvements, and possibly most Orwellian, home first. Is what's wrong with it that, as Simon Galton has pointed out, there will be a gap of 20 million by 22-23. But Labour councils across the country are facing the same pressures and doing many of the same things, and we should be, and we are rightly, in my group, proud of our officers for keeping this council afloat, unlike Northampton. And we're pleased that we're investing our capital in special educational needs and in the roads network. We're not so sure about buying office blocks in Nottingham and Lichfield, and we're certainly not understanding why we've got a Citroen dealership in Leicester City, especially as I drive a Skoda. So, is the problem with it that we've got a government that is preaching the gospel of prevention, meanwhile cutting budgets for public health and giving us no certainty of future funding for troubled families or better care? Or is it the proposal, as the revenue support grant disappears, to raise the precept by 3.99%, with 1% of this being for social care for our most vulnerable? Well, some socially responsible people will welcome paying an extra 50 quid. They'll see it as a good investment in a civil society. So, Chair, what is wrong with this budget? Is it the problem that is so big it's difficult to see? I think one of the problems I have with it is council tax support, because even the poorest are now expected to pay towards council services. And that means we are going to be collecting an additional £7 a year. Might not sound a lot, but it's from someone who is expected by the collecting authority to be able to live on £77 a week. So, voting for this budget, as it says on page 20, means voting for point F, which means voting for district councils to take any other action which may be necessary to give effect to the precepts. I think that includes sending in the bailiffs. Voting for this budget means agreeing to shift the responsibility for creating a caring and civilised society away from the general taxation of the few who benefit most from living and working in this country and onto the shoulders of the many, including those least able to pay. For Labour, voting for this budget would bury, along with all our other lost causes, the socialist principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. I'm afraid, Chair, that the Labour Group will not be voting for this budget.
Thank you, Dr. Hennion. Mr. Mullaney, please.
This proposed budget, as with last year's, is another budget that will cost people in Leicestershire more and deliver them less. Residents face a 3.99% council tax rise, plus cuts to services, including vital services such as bus services. We also see the Sure Start centres facing closure, nearly half of those vital services for families facing closure. So why are residents in Leicestershire paying more, and why are residents in Leicestershire getting less for that money? It's because of the consistent failure of the Conservative leadership of this county council and the all Conservative MPs in the county to deliver the fair funding this county needs. We are still one of the worst funded counties in the country, and that is why every year we keep having more council tax rises and more essential services cut. And now we see that what was left of the revenue support grant, even that's gone. There's no money coming from the government from that. Another huge letdown for the people of Leicestershire. And that's why we in this group believe that inflicting a huge council tax rise and service cuts on the residents of Leicestershire is unfair, and that's why we won't support this budget. With this government's position further weakened by today's events, our 7 Leicestershire Conservative MPs should be able to wield even more influence in this hung Parliament. And if the 10 DUP MPs can get £1 billion for Northern Ireland, why can't our 7 Leicestershire MPs say it's not acceptable that we're voted in as Conservatives and get the worst deal in the country? Let's see them use their position in this Parliament to deliver the fair funding that Leicestershire needs, so that we won't keep needing these huge council tax rises and service cuts. Because we've got a Conservative government at the moment, all Conservative MPs, a Conservative county council, and every borough and district council bar one is Conservative. And yet there is a collective failure from these Conservatives who've been elected in Leicestershire to deliver the fair funding our area needs, which is why we keep having these incessant cuts and service cuts and tax rises. We do not support this budget. It is an unfair budget. It will hit people with higher council tax rises, and it will see essential services cut. That is why we will oppose it today, and why we again call upon the Conservatives to start delivering the fair deal that our county needs. It is unacceptable that people keep voting the Conservatives in and yet still keep getting such a bad deal from the Conservatives, which means they're having to pay more and get less.
Thank you, Mr. Mullaney. And it's up to all of us, whatever individual party we are, to fight for fairer funding. And we do, and I hope you join us. Mrs. Newton, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. We are now in the 10th year of the government's austerity cuts, and with every year that passes, it becomes harder and harder to deliver essential services to the most vulnerable people in our county. In her conference speech last September, the Prime Minister declared that austerity was at an end. Really? The Chancellor's last budget, while recognising the immediate pressures facing councils, announced grant funding of £650 million for the year 2019-20. However, the reality is that the amount available for social care for the next year, arising from this figure, is £240 million. and according to the Association of Directors of Social Services, this falls well short of the 2.3 billion required for the same period. In fact, councils are required at least this amount just to cope with care for the increasing number of elderly people with more complex needs. In other words, the funding provided by the Chancellor will only just stave off the total collapse of the system. For year on year, the adult social care system has been failing older people, their families and carers, and it will face a 2.1 billion funding gap by 2019-20. And this is happening at a time when there is really this growing demand for the services. The result is that many local authorities, including this one, find themselves in a position of trying to meet urgent needs while balancing their budgets. The few efficiency savings being made here and there simply add to the hardship already faced by many people. And these savings are one-off savings which cannot be repeated. Moreover, the additional funding from government, while offering some relief to councils, amounts to little more than a temporary sticking plaster measure, when what is really needed is a long-term strategy on how to tackle the huge issue of spiralling social care costs. The government's recently announced NHS long-term plan has welcomed focusing on integrating health and care provision and driving forward the preventative agenda. A similar long-term approach to adult social care is urgently needed, one that offers assurance of a sustainable funding base so that services can keep pace with our ageing population over the next 20 to 30 years. So while we were told that the austerity is over, the reality is that for local government, it's the same old story of rising costs in adult social care and children's services, continuing to swallow up an increasing share of a very diminishing cake. I look forward to the Green Paper that has been promised, but once again delayed. It is a matter of extreme urgency that government provides a long-term funding solution for social care in all its forms. There simply has been a long-term, there has to be a long-term funding strategy for adult social care. So urgent is the need that it may well need, some experts have said, that what you're going to need is a cross-party solution and a cross-party response to this crisis. The use of council tax to cover adult social care costs is, in my view, only a temporary measure. Many experts suggest there needs to be a dedicated NHS and care tax based on a reformed national insurance system with the ability to set this figure locally so that we can to some extent more accurately assess and meet our needs. This is something that should be given serious consideration by government. The experts have been calling for a government long-term strategy for tackling the funding crisis of adult social care for many years. I do hope that sometime in the future that this plea will be heard. I'm just saying that I won't be supporting this budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs Newton. Mr Sheehan, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, well, as I think we know, one of the consequences of prolonged austerity is child poverty. This in turn drives demand for children's services. And as a council, we can do our best to support vulnerable families and children. And this budget is, on the surface, a plausible attempt to manage a difficult financial situation. But it is built on numerous assumptions, including growth in demand, and there is considerable risk that these plans will unravel if those assumptions turn out to be wrong. Mr Chairman, it remains as true this year as it was last year that the lack of sustainable funding for children's and indeed all demand-led services must be addressed as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Sheehan. Mr Old, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I don't share all the gloomy predictions that have been echoed by previous speakers. But I am much closer to what Sean Sheehan has just said than perhaps any other speaker who's spoken in the debate thus far. If you read this budget carefully, you will see that the County Council has to respond to demand-led budgets. And that means that the assumptions that we take can be wrong. And there is an area already where the budget will have to be adjusted to accommodate something that's only happened within the last 2 months. And that is the rate of unaccompanied asylum seekers. So that in January 17 there weren't any. In February 17 there were 2 fewer than the year before. In January 18 there was an increase of 2. February 18, no increase. In 19, this year, 15 in January and 4 in February. And those members who sit on the Overview and Scrutiny Committee for Children and Families know already that that particular budget heading is overspent in the current financial year. So in that sense, I agree with the comments that Sean has made about the difficult predictions. Equally, in the report, we refer to an estimate for children coming into care. Now, should the age assessments that are currently taking place with many of the unaccompanied asylum seekers prove that they are indeed children, then the figure that you've got in the report will be at least 19 below what we were expecting it to be. And what does that then mean? That means that we have to focus what we've got to its maximum effect, and that is what I think this budget does quite brilliantly. I haven't heard anybody commend Byron Rhodes and Nick Rushton for their attitude towards what the government calls troubled families and we call supporting Leicestershire families, where money was put into the budget last year and again this year to make sure that the most vulnerable families in the county actually get the help that they need. And if we can prevent, we can cut back on the numbers of children who come into care at a later stage where they are vastly more expensive. I look in particular at paragraphs 78 and 79, which outline items of growth. I also look at the overspending potential. It's not for nothing that I get regularly teased by the leader for being the NHS of local government. And yeah, there are times when I get fed up with it. It would be really great to come in with a monthly budget statement that showed everything in the red. Sorry, in the green. I was in the red. That was a Freudian slip. And I hope you'll forgive me for that. Because you do worry. You try and stay within budget because you know that if you overspend in one area, in order to have a balanced budget, you've got to find it from elsewhere. High needs is an example of exceptionally good planning, based on really good quality relationships with the schools in the county. I haven't met a councillor yet who disagrees with the notion that we should provide locally for these children. You ship them out in a coach or a taxi across the county. Who do they make friends with? Nobody in their particular area. And I would hope that all councillors will support this growth bid on high needs, and I hope that the schools out there and the people that will be taking part in the consultation will find much to admire and support. The Family Wellbeing Service does replace the old Children's Centres programme. And those who saw, again on the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, the detailed resume know that some children's centres had no Sure Start type activities going on in them at all. They were almost exclusively to do with the NHS, who, unlike the city, weren't contributing in the county. I think we still have 21 children's centres. It's a pretty good number. It's aimed at the greatest areas of need. There was a strong representation from Labour in Loughborough, and as a result, an additional centre was kept open. So your voice has resonance. It doesn't just go into a vacuum. But I have to disagree with Simon over the youth service. When Labour were in power, they wanted to expand the youth service. We had to regularly send in figures. And the numbers of children in the county who attended youth service facilities was 14%. And even at the end of considerable expansion, it only reached 22%. So the evidence is that 3 out of every 4 young people did not participate in youth work. Many of them went to private youth facilities such as the Guides, the Brownies, the Scouts and various voluntary groups. And actually think it's, if you look at what we've got at the moment, we've got Cycle, we've got the impact teams still in effect. We send people regularly down into the youth parliament. We've focused it down to people who can benefit. And this budget, in my view, actually focuses it down to those people who most need it. And I commend it to the Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Auld. Mr. Osborne, please.
Thank you, Chairman. When I listened to the presentation by my good friend Byron on the budget, I was surprised in the papers on page 29, where he says, the end of austerity message does come with the caveat of securing a good Brexit. That has not been defined. If we're commenting on about austerity budgets, could I remind colleagues of quoting from the Chief Economist, Mr. Haldane of the Bank of England, who said the balance of risks associated with tightening too early on the one hand and too late on the other has swung materially to the latter. Now, the primary duty of any of us as councillors is to represent the concerns expressed by residents. And I have questions that come to me from residents in my area that are centred on the budget, its priorities, and any perceived wasteful spending. If I could say, for example, the spending on a unitary council. This council commissioned a report in 2014 which stated there would be a saving of £30 million per annum. That report was binned. But if it's right to do so now, it was wrong to bin it in 2014. And if it had been carried out in 2014, as if then you are saying that was correct, the council would be on target to save money. In this case, 30 million for the last 4 years. That's 120 million, and we wouldn't be talking here about an austerity budget in the first place. The council, in the intervening years, has spent money in promoting a combined authority. That now has been binned. There are preventative and support programmes that have been reduced even when those projects save this council money in the medium and longer term by helping disadvantaged families. Now, I promised residents in my area, whether I agreed with them or not, that I would raise their concerns, as they have every right that their concerns should be expressed and expressed publicly. And I accept the duty today is to present and pass a balanced budget. No proper alternative has been presented, nor do I think it will be with the motion that will be soon put. And I will support the budget, but with a cautionary thought that winning today for us is easy. But winning the vote is not everything that matters. Winning the argument is. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. Mrs. Posnett, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to talk about the public health budget. The financial year 2019-20 is the last year, as far as we know, of the public health grant. Over the last 5 years, the grant has been cut year on year. This year is no different, with a further reduction in grant of round about £600,000. Oh, for the worries of our National Health Service colleagues in dealing with funding increases and not increasing with the rate of the NHS inflation. As in previous years, the department will seek to minimise the impact of that funding reduction by ensuring best value from commissioned services, redesigning services to reduce cost whilst maintaining effectiveness, bringing services in-house where possible, and maintaining initiatives which support communities to support themselves. Inevitable though service reduction will be, It will also need to happen. To this end, 2019 has already seen the newly commissioned Sexual Health Service becoming operational, saving approximately £300,000. Lifestyle change sessions coming in-house later this year, saving a further £65,000, and ongoing work on redesigning support for preventing homelessness, with a view to a further £200,000 saving. Inevitably, there will be some element of service reduction in these changes and a loss of some posts from within the department as a result of changes necessary to balance the budget. Despite this, though, a recent LGA document has found that since public health came back to local government in 2013, 80% of public health indicators have either improved in performance or performance has stayed the same. I think this is testament to the work of public health and that local government is the natural home for public health work. At this stage, though, there is no clarity from central government as to whether public health will be funded from retained business rates after April 2020, or whether it is intended that the grant will continue. Additionally, the recent NHS long-term plan suggested that the NHS would like a greater role in commissioning public health services, such as school nursing, health visiting, and sexual health. Whatever the outcome of this intended review by the NHS of public health commissioning, it is clear that the NHS is a complement to our work, not a substitute. There can be no better influence on public health than properly funded local government and properly funded local government public health services. I will be supporting the motion.
Thank you, Mrs Bosnett. Mrs Richardson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Although we're having to look at different ways for delivery of our services and to make savings, we are still being able to support our communities, both in partnership with other organisations and as a council in our own right. And I've just pulled a few things out because I think sometimes they get missed amongst all the other larger items. We have the signposting and community support service, which with funding from the County Council and District Councils, Leicestershire and Charnwood Citizens Advice Services have helped people with advice and support to tackle a range of issues, including debts, benefits, employment and housing. So far this year, the CABs have supported well over 10,000 clients and have achieved financial gains for them of over £4 million. County Council hardship and crisis support, delivered with District Council and voluntary sector partners, has supported over 300 people with predominantly reused and graded furniture and white goods, over 600 people with emergency food and around 370 people with help to heat their homes. And in addition, support for Leicestershire Charity Link has helped over 500 Leicestershire residents with essential household items with the help of around £100,000 of grants from local and national charities. We also have suicide prevention led by public health. Death from suicide has devastating consequences for family, friends and colleagues, with an average of 55 deaths from suicide each year in Leicestershire. It remains the biggest killer of men under 50 and the leading cause of death in young people. Leicestershire County Council has played a leading role in developing and launching the Start the Conversation Suicide is Preventable website and campaign to coincide with the World Suicide Prevention Day that was on 10th of September 2018. The campaign and website were developed working with many key partners around Leicestershire, across Leicestershire, Leicester City and Rutland, and carry the message suicide is preventable. And through raising awareness and talking openly, hopes to prevent death by suicide and build suicide-safe communities. The website is a key local platform for information and support and is continually evolving. And since the website launch, there have been more than 30,000 website hits, 14 organisations pledged support and 45 individuals have pledged their support. We have the Shire grants. 2018-19 awarded 367,000 to 78 projects, including a reallocation of £17,000 of Shire funds. Mearsham Medical Unit Patient Participation Group was awarded £600 for gardening tours to support a new gardening group where participants are referred to the group by the GP practice, helping to reduce isolation and loneliness, improve health and well-being by regular outdoor exercise and social activity. New Life Community Church was awarded a grant of £9,916 to support the set-up of a new food bank in the Gorse Covert area of Loughborough. Costs included a metal shipping container to operate the service from, power supply to the container, shelving and other storage for the food and vehicle. The service is now operating, supporting local individuals and families, and it will shortly also be delivering food to those that can't travel to the church. This will also form part of the Charnwood Food Poverty Group, which is made up from several key partners and stakeholders, including Leicestershire County Council, Charnwood Borough Council, FareShare, Ex-Airco Trust, Fearon Hall and the Salvation Army. We also have the LEADER programme, which is supporting rural communities. 28 projects have been contracted to a total of £875,581. 15 of the projects have been completed so far. We have another £558,952 still available to be contracted before the end of June. With all the applications that we're still having them coming through, we will be oversubscribed by £43,425. So there is an awful lot going on within communities, and we support our communities, and I'll be supporting the budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs Richardson. Mr Parton, please.
Now, in Loughborough South, there's a blind man who uses a guide dog, and he asked that a particular junction had 6 to 8 tactile slabs. So I asked Highways and asked them to action. It's a simple request. And the answer came back that it wasn't possible, that the council couldn't afford it. The council doesn't want to say no, it wants to say yes. And thank you that the council did say yes to the retention of the Shelthorpe Sure Start Centre. But people know that this council has to make huge savings. I mean, only yesterday, somebody asked me, could him and his neighbours help pay the electricity bill to keep the street lights on in their street? But it helps to talk about the real impacts that these financial pressures placed upon us, how they actually physically impact. Now, we have 3 core duties, don't we? We have to fulfil our statutory duties, we have to keep our highways safe, and then, morally, we have to help the most vulnerable. And as we campaign, all of us, campaign for fairer funding, but that other councils will lobby and say, if you gain, we lose. Remind them of the story of that man with the guide dog. We are doing our best. We are doing what we need to do. Some good news. The Charnwood Borough Council, as part of the Town Centre Master Plan, will put these tactile slabs in for this blind man with his dog. But we are doing our best.
Thank you, Mr Parton. Mr Payne, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I wasn't going to speak to the main motion because, as already identified, we have an amendment and I was going to speak to that. But as Mr Galton has already raised a few points that will lead into the amendment, I'm just going to tackle a few of those issues right now before I speak more substantively on the amendment. Mr Galton identified that a lot of this council's expenditure, particularly in my service area, is needed by the most vulnerable in our society. And I'd agree. And I'd point Mr Galton to one of the growth items in this year's budget is 1.4 million, rising to nearly 3.5 million by 2022-23 for special educational needs transport. This is a real pressure. Mr Old spoke about the demand-led pressures upon this council. My department has overspent by £1 million, or nearly £1 million, on special educational needs transport this year alone. Hence, we've got to make difficult decisions in our overall transport budget. I also just want to pick up on a couple of other issues. Mr Galton, and I feel I need to rebut this, Mr Galton gave the impression that the public were opposed to our passenger transportation policy. I don't believe they're opposed. I think they're quite sympathetic, empathetic towards what we're trying to achieve. What they're opposed to is the use of any other transport but a bus. But we've already heard from the leader, Nick Rushton, that there are many other ways. The transport industry is going through a revolution at the moment, and we are, along with the demand pressures, trying to utilise some of the new ways of approaching transportation. So whilst I accept the public, through the consultation, might not like the use of other transport modes, and they want to retain a bus, that's simply not possible where we sit at the moment. And the other thing I'd just like to put straight, Mr Galton mentioned that many of the routes in our passenger transportation review on the bus subsidies will be condemned, many routes will be condemned to history. Well, that's either a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation. I believe it's a misinterpretation, given the time of year we're at and what's just around the corner. But I can assure Mr Galton, and I'll speak further on this later on, that the review that we're undertaking will only remove routes as a last resort. We're not seeking to remove routes, we're seeking to use our monies in the most efficient way. I'll speak to the amendment. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr Payne. Now, Mr Crooks, do you want to speak on this or the amendment? Thank you. So I'll now go to Mr Bolter, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I rise to move the amendment under my name on the order paper. However, it's perhaps a little unfortunate when it came to committee that this item appeared £400,000 cuts. The next item on the agenda was £400,000 increase for the next 3 years for HS2. Bit of bad timing, possibly. However, it's been raised this afternoon about various other things, and I expected the leaders and others have to go at me over the loan to a certain county council. However, when we asked the officers would they do it again at committee, they said no, we wouldn't. So that to me gave indication that perhaps we weren't too far off the mark in the first place. I also like to raise, while I'm on my feet, regarding the trading standards. The leader at scrutiny did say that he would aim to put the money back for trading standards. It is back. Thank you very much indeed. As to the amendment, right. We have a great deal of problems. I've been contacted by several people regarding the possible cuts to their bus service. Other members have all received messages and emails from people who are concerned about their bus services. This is not just about means of getting from A to B. It's a means of getting rid of social isolation. Many people who live in these far-flung communities look forward to their day out to the market towns, or their visit to the market towns, or visit to the doctors. It's not just about getting to A to B, it's about the social aspect of joining other people on that journey and enjoying the journey while they're there. DRT and other things will not give them that sense of being part of a bigger community. So we need to think very carefully about this. I know that pressures are very tight. The amendment says where the money can come from for the next 3 years. Other members of the Cabinet say, oh, there's a revolution in transport. We're going to have driverless cars. We're going to have wonderful new things coming. If they're so convinced of that, let them vote for this amendment this afternoon. It gives 3 years space in which they can get their driverless cars into these different areas. I'm sure, Chairman, that if the goodwill of the Conservative group and the Conservative government, if they really think about driverless cars and moving forward, they will vote for this amendment to keep the bus services going until these new vehicles or new ways of travelling actually come into fruition. Mr Payne has already said there's a revolution in transport. Fine. Let's wait for the revolution to take place before we pull the rug from under what we've already got. Services which are vital to various areas and will not be supported if this amendment is not carried this afternoon. And remember, I wonder why bus service has been extended till June. I wonder why we picked the month of June. Could it be because these local members are up for election in May and they want to pull the bus service before then? It's been extended till June, that's taken place. The other thing we wonder is, when will it be announced which routes are going to be retained and which routes are going to be axed? Was that going to wait until June as well, or will that come out in April to give people enough time? Just a few questions, Chair, that raise a bit of doubt. We've asked most of the questions. Bear in mind, this is where the money could come from. Also bear in mind that General Fund Reserve is going up from 16 million to 23 million by 2021. This is not money that's already there. There's an option to take it from that budget. But on consulting with the officers, they suggest it could come from the budget as mentioned on the order paper. But the reserves are going up. And don't forget, there's also £8 million contingency reserve as well. So we're not saying take it out of that. Mr Rhodes will say, you're touching reserves. It's not reserves. If we're taking that from budget, it's not in the reserves yet. It's not earmarked reserves yet. But we're not doing that. We're taking it from future funding. What's more beneficial to the people of this county? Buying more accommodation outside the county or keeping a bus service for them that gets them from A to B in a safe, convenient way for them to continue their journey. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr Bolter. Mr Crooks, please.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I rise formally to second the amendment. Whilst these proposed cuts to funding could affect all rural bus services, I'm obviously interested in trying to save the Roberts 159 service, which runs between Colville and Hinckley, passing through numerous villages, 6 of which I represent. In some cases, this service is the only public transport available to residents, and cutting the service will isolate these people. Students who travel to both Stevenson's College in Colville and Warwickshire and Hinckley College in Hinckley would not be able to attend. Several residents of these villages also work in Hinckley, and if the service was to be cut, they would lose their jobs. Many elderly residents use the service to access shops and medical practices. Without this bus service, they will be trapped. Whilst I am campaigning for this particular service, many councillors in this chamber who come June, when the review of buses and support funding takes place, could be in the same position. Cutting 400,000 per year will have a drastic effect on bus service provision, especially in rural areas. But cutting this level of funding from a budget of 370 million will be a minor portion in comparison. I second this amendment.
Thank you, Mr Crooks. Mr Payne, please.
Okay, thank you, Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to speak to the amendment. Okay, just to deliver some information on the background here. As Mr Bolter raised the issue of the election, I believe this amendment is part of an election process, in all honesty. I think we've brought through the scrutiny system and the cabinet system a policy which clearly identifies how we are to approach our passenger transportation policy. And members will shortly be seeing the 5 phases come through the system. They will be engaged with directly all those members affected at least a week before any notifications are offered to bus companies. And like I said before, it is the intention of the department to use the removal of a service as a last resort. Let me just put some perspective on the budgets that we're dealing with. Over the last medium term, over the last 4 or 5 years, the department saved about £47 million. Austerity hasn't ended. We've got a further £2 million within this budget and the medium-term financial strategy to find. The net expenditure this year is about 67 million. The gross expenditure is about 90 million. Out of that expenditure, we spend over 28 million pounds a year on transportation services, of which currently about 2.3 million is on passenger bus services. We spoke earlier on about special educational needs. We'll be spending £11.2 million a year on transporting special educational needs, and we've got a provision for growth. We talk about mainstream school transport. There's a further £4 million there. Social care transport, 3.7 million. Fleet transport, 310,000. Concessionary fares, monies that go directly to bus companies. We spend about £5.1 million on concessionary fares. You add all this up, another expenditure, it totals £28 million a year. This authority is spending a huge amount on transportation services. And it's with that in mind that we have a cake, and it needs to be carved up accordingly, which means tough choices. And one of those choices is to bring forward into this MTFS a proposal to save around £400,000 a year on our public bus subsidies. And I think we're doing that in a way that is pragmatic, intuitive, and it brings members and communities along with us. Now, in terms of the revolution that we spoke about, transportation isn't just about getting people around. We're seeing in the news the closure of the Honda factory in Swindon. The government have already legislated by 2040 to ban the combustion engine. There are certain measures on diesel engines. We spoke about the taxi industry, Uber, the changing nature of the taxi industry. There is a revolution in transportation, and yet we're seeing a demand-led service in passenger transportation, which is reducing. Commercial bus companies, of which 94% of all passenger journeys in Leicestershire are commercially operated, we subsidise about 6% of passenger journeys. But unfortunately, passenger journeys on buses are reducing for a variety of reasons, and we need to react to that. We are currently subsidising some routes to the tune of £14 to £17 per passenger journey, and I think everyone in this room will accept that is a questionable use of public taxpayers' money. So clearly we need to come up with a new system. We haven't had a policy before, and we've just introduced one, and now we're implementing that policy. The reason we can't support this amendment today is because not only does it put further pressure on other departments, and more particularly money would have to be found within my department, maybe taken for special educational needs where the pressures are growing, as we've already spoken about, but also because we need to make sure that we have a policy that can get residents and people around Leicestershire to their points where they need to get to and to where the amenities are. We're not promising, if you like, a gold-plated service. What we're saying is we'll provide transport on essential need. But it is the case that we have put emergency injections to the tune of about £240,000 since 2017 into certain bus services, and we need to curb the demand on this particular budget. So we've got huge budgetary pressures in the transportation area of the department. We have a changing picture in terms of how people are using transport, and we're simply responding to that. That is why I believe that we cannot support the amendment here today, and I think there might be other members that speak positively about the demand-responsive transport solutions that we're considering and other types of transport solutions that we're considering to mitigate the impact of our changing passenger transportation service. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Mrs. Radford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I fully support what my Cabinet lead member is saying, as I'm a support worker. As an authority, we need to save money, and you have to ask yourself if subsidising bus companies' bus rates, which cost over £13 per passenger, is justified. I am of the opinion that bus companies could be more flexible. Take my area of Shepshed. We have a bus company which services an area with a bus every 15 minutes. It was until very recently every 10 minutes. Most of the time they follow each other over the same roads. We have another area in Shepshed which is crying out for a bus route. Both myself and officers have asked if bus companies could send one of the two buses down the other area. Not viable is the answer, but unless it is tried, we do not know whether it will be profitable. I am sure it would be more cost effective than having 2 buses running in the same same area empty. But what we've got to remember, if buses are only running with 1 or 2 people in, they are polluting the area. And I know that that is a sore point in some people, that we have to look at the pollution that sometimes these buses are making. If they were fully utilised, then it's not a problem. But if there's only 1 or 2 passengers in, then it's not a viable solution. Thank you.
Mr. Meyer, please.
We, on the Labour side, fully support this amendment. We think it's a sensible amendment. Takes into consideration a piece that I think was going to be cut last year, and then at the last minute I think it was put back in. I don't think anybody's mentioned that one. I wonder why. I think it was election time, but obviously county councillors aren't up for election this time round. District councillors are, so they can be lambs to the slaughter, as they say. But anyway, so coming back to this amendment, £400,000 in the grand scheme of things, when you're spending £300–400 million, isn't a lot. But for the people that rely on this service, it is a lot. You know, what they get could be life-changing for them. What we take away will be life-changing. In my area, there's a threat that the number 13 bus will disappear. So people in the furthest part of my division won't have access to a bus service into the town centre. And it's their only bus service. So if that one goes, there is no other bus services in that area for people to catch. And Councillor Ivan Old talked about people struggling to walk 200 metres to the nearest bus stop. And I could understand technological marvels may happen. But remember in the 60s, some of you might do, we're supposed to be living on the moon by now. So it might not happen.
Some of us are.
Some of us maybe. You're welcome to it.
So yeah, let's not put all our eggs on one basket, but let's invest and let's keep this. It's only for 3 years. It's putting it back into the budget. Cost that where it's going to come from. In the big scheme of things, when our reserves are going up by £6 or £7 million extra, it's not money that we can't not afford. It's a political choice. Do we want it or don't we want it? And I think members on this side of the House making the sensible choice that we want it and we want to keep it for our residents. Members on the left, to my left, as they say, don't think it's important enough for residents to keep this service, and they will wishy-washy and talk about other things regardless. But I think £400,000 is a small fry, and we should keep this service in the budget. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Just a point of clarification. There were no elections last year. Mrs. Seaton.
Thank you, Chair. A typical Labour response, really. £400,000 here, what the hell? £400,000 there, what the hell? You've got up to nearly £1 million already, but what the hell? We have got to make decisions, hard decisions. And if I am subsidising up to the terms of £17 per passenger on a bus, I think that is ludicrous. Not just financially, environmentally ludicrous. Now, at the moment, the County Council go to 30+ villages to take passengers on demand-led transport. OK, it's not ideal. It's not you waiting at a bus stop, waiting for a bus every 10 minutes to come along and just take you. You can't go to town on impulse anymore. You've got to book up a week in advance. Maybe it needs looking at. Maybe that needs to be developed. And maybe that's one of the things that we're talking about, changing the transport, the way we think about transport in the future. There's also, we've got a department here called Choose How You Move. You can go on there and plan your route. And it tells you what buses to catch and what time to get there. So probably that needs to be developed and encourage people to use it. We've also got called Dial a Ride. Dial a Ride is a brilliant service. And I didn't even know it existed until we in Thurmaston lost a bus service. And of course it affects the most vulnerable people in our communities, which is the elderly people. It meant that they had to walk that extra 400 metres to another bus stop. But I got in touch with Dial a Ride. Brilliant. They'll pick them up at the door. They'll take them to set areas, supermarkets, into the Leicester City to do the shopping, pick them up and bring them back. And that's something that we need to encourage people to use. I will not be supporting this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs Seaton. I fully support Dial a Ride. I've got my residents using it, and it's a very, very valuable service. Gets them to hospital and around the county. Mr Rushton, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I say that I'm particularly disappointed with the opposition today. You moaned when we abolished the March Council, so we went to a lot of trouble to amend the Constitution so you can bring notices of motion and things to this Council, and you've singularly failed to bring anything. And to bring one little minor amendment of 400,000 to a £350 million budget makes me wonder what you do throughout the year if this is the only thing you can find wrong with our budget. And then also, don't forget, if you pass your amendment, you will have to vote for the rest of the budget. So you've just said you won't vote for the budget. So is the only thing out of £360 million that you're willing to vote for today is £400,000 for buses? Now, honestly, is that the truth? I mean, people watching on the web, which there won't be thousands, but they won't believe how you're handling the budget, that you're just nitpicking on 400,000. And then you won't be able to vote for the main budget anyway, because you said you won't support it. And then a few more facts about the bus routes in Leicestershire. 94% of the bus routes in Leicestershire are unsubsidised. We're talking about 6% here. Now, what happens in June? All contracts are extended to June. You may pick on June as being a bad date. We could have gone for May, we could have gone for July. It just so happens that they've all been synchronised to end in June. Then, when they've all ended, we're going to look at them. If we can carry on subsidising because they are relatively well used. Obviously, if they're not that well used, if they were well used, they won't be subsidised at all. So don't forget that. They'd be run commercially. We will continue to subsidise them. Brenda's had a very valid point. There are plenty of other opportunities to transport yourself around the county. And nobody, even Liberals, can't justify £18 per person subsidy on a bus. I don't honestly believe even you can justify that. And also, let's not forget, transportation and getting to places isn't about a dirty old bus belching out diesel, trundling through your village with one person on it. There's got to be loads more ways of getting people from where they are to where they want to go efficiently and quickly and cleanly. So I will urge my side to certainly not support this budget. We are doing particularly well with the money we are...
Order! Order!
Sorry? Don't support this amendment. We're doing particularly well finding money to support the subsidised bus network in the financial situation we are, because a lot of counties, and when I say a lot, I mean a lot, have given up completely and don't subsidise them at all. And then also remember the big figure that Blake has outlined to you. We are spending £28 million on transportation of people in this county.
Thank you, Mr Rushton. I've got two more speakers. Mr Shepherd, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't think either the proposer or seconder of the amendment would pretend to us for a moment is anything like a strategic alternative to a budget which covers all the Council's expenditures. By contrast, among the speeches from the colleagues in my group, we've heard from Mr Payne a comprehensive and clearly very well informed and understood account of exactly what is going on in the department and when outcomes will be produced. You've heard my colleague Mrs Seaton speak vigorously and enthusiastically about what can be achieved by alternative means. What we have got, of course, is an amendment which is motivated by a forthcoming borough election, by the need to find copy for focus leaflets, and by the exploitation of understandable uncertainty among the public whilst we all await the outcome of the department's work. But in terms of a grand opposition strategy, I think not.
Mr Galton, please.
Chairman, I find there's a lot of hand-wringing going on here. I mean, it's a pathetic response, isn't it? The solution to this problem is driverless cars. That's what we're being told by that side of the chamber, Uber. 20 years away, probably. We're talking about bus services now and what people need to get around. And as has been reminded to us by Mr Jewell two years ago, it was that side. It was in the budget to take out £1 million from bus services, and you amended your own budget on the floor of this chamber the day of the budget meeting to put the money back in a few weeks before the county council elections. Now you're saying, oh, well, you know, we've got to go back and put this in and make these cuts again. Mr Payne's defence, I didn't hear anything about local bus services. I didn't hear any response to the heartfelt emails that he and I and other members have received about the impact of what's going to happen if those services that are on the red list, and it's my understanding that those on the red list are very likely to go. And then there's those on the amber list that might go. And I looked at some of the, the leader says, oh, there's one person riding around some of the bus. I checked one of the ones on the amber list. It has 6,000 passenger journeys, and yet it's on the amber list. And Mr Payne hasn't explained why it is that we're threatening to take away bus services that 6,000 passenger journeys are used. He hasn't answered that problem. Actually, he accuses us of this being an election. I think his mind is on other things today. His mind, I think, is on, what is it, police and crime nominations. That's where he is on this issue, instead of focusing on his current responsibilities as lead member for transport. So I'm surprised we haven't had the criticism where you're getting this money from in terms of the future developments, and this is all vital and it's all accounted for and we need it. Well, a lot of that money isn't yet committed. We haven't decided where it's going from. But my understanding is, Mr Chair, my understanding is that's where we bought the Citroen garage out of the future developments funds. So we need, this is about priorities, Mr Chairman. This is about whether buying Citroen garages and bits of land round is more important than keeping bus services going for 6,000 people around there. That's the argument. If we can find £400,000 to mitigate the impact of HS2, as the Cabinet did on the same day, agreed the cuts of the bus services, we can find in a budget of £370 million, £400,000 to keep bus services going. And as Mr Bolter said, if you're right, and if we're looking to this great revolution of transport where people ring up and get an Uber and get there in 4 years' time, then you can take the money out and the job will be done. But we're a bit more sceptical about whether that's going to happen. So it's very clear, this is about priorities. Keep the bus services going. Vote for a small increase in using some money that's sitting there that's not yet committed, and then we can actually start to address some of the cuts that we've made in recent years. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr Galton. Mr Bray.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chairman. I would just say to the leader, I will point out, of course, that I did raise 2 questions here, which are very important matters to people in my division. They might be quite small beer, but as he's scrapped the highway forum, I've got nowhere else to raise them. But I think Councillor Galton's right. Maybe that's the answer to the bus services. Now the county council's bought a car dealership, they perhaps think that people won't need bus transport. The leader's obviously the new Leicestershire version of Boise. He's going to, anyway, on a serious point, when I put my hand up to when I was listening to Councillor Payne speaking, and Blake, as he always does, makes a very articulate speech. But I do think that the county council has fallen into a bit of a trap, and he's fallen into a bit of a trap. And that is, it is all very well when we go out and ask the public, and I did it when I was leader of Hinckley as well. You go out and ask the public on grand policies and grand the rest of it. If you're lucky, you'll get any response at all to these things. But they're put in such a way that people respond in a sort of fairly neutral way. But it's not until that bus service that used to call at the end of their street disappears that then public start to get exercised about it and wake up to the fact that what is happening. And of course, by that point, it's too late to do anything about it. The service is gone, the infrastructure is gone, and all the rest of it. And I think, I think there is a point. I think there's a very valid point that buses might not be the best form of transport in the future. They are a little bit old hat. And there may be emerging technologies that make the whole thing better. But let's keep the buses in place until we've got that stuff that's better, and not get rid of it, what we've got now, and hope that something better might come down the line in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Bray. Now, over to you, Mr. Rhodes.
Yeah, well, we've had a few speeches on this one, haven't we? Look, what I think a lot of members on the opposition benches are doing here is simply saying, look, we've got a service here and it's uncomfortable to make the change. Let's be again it, and it's a bit of publicity, and as other members have mentioned, elections are coming up, and well, why wouldn't we do that? Take a bigger role. You're county councillors, not district councillors in this chamber. And in county councils, we've got to look at the strategic position of the county council and look ahead. If we've got a situation, as we have, where many of these bus services are increasingly not being used, and that is to say, they're declining year on year, to the extent that some journeys are requiring, and some of the parts of the service are requiring these enormous subsidies per journey, then clearly we have a duty to do something about it. And that means looking at the service and trying to find an alternative way of still supporting people who need services, but not necessarily by doing it with a bus that runs every hour or every 2 hours or whatever. Now, what the department have been charged with is looking at that to find a solution. It's fair to say you haven't yet seen what the proposed solution is. And I've only seen part of it as relates to my division. And I know they're still looking at some of the other features of it. And an awful lot of the subsidised services, I have to say, are in my division because I've got a very rural area. What we do have to do, though, is start to move in a gradual way towards the future, where we do still provide support for those who can't drive, but also do it at a cost which is acceptable. And this £400,000 saving, which we hope comes out of this review that we're carrying out, which will reduce the amount of subsidy that we currently provide, is a step towards doing that. And it's not the right way just to walk away every time you want to make a constructive step towards making this council more efficient. Now, this group, of course, as the leader has said, will vote against the amendment because we have to. We have to take a mature view, a county council view, and look towards the future and continuous improvement towards making this a more efficient council.
Thank you, Mr. Rhodes. I now move to a vote. It'll be a recorded vote on the amendment. No. No right to reply.
So, members, the Council's constitution and standing orders reflect the legal requirement that any proposition at a budget meeting relating to the calculation of or the issuing of the precept must be recorded in the minutes so as to show whether each member present gave his or her vote for or against the proposal or abstained from voting. So I'm going to invite you, please, to indicate whether you wish to vote for or against the amendment to the motion put by Mr Bolter and seconded by Mr Crooks. Mr Barclay. Mr Bedford. Against. Mr Bentley. Against. Mr Bill. Mr Blunt. Against. Mr Bolter. Against. Mr Bray. Against. Mr Brecon. Against. Dr Bremner. Mrs Broadley. Mr Charlesworth. Mr Coxon. Mr Crooks. Dr Eynon. Dr Feltham. Mrs Fryer, Mr Galton, Mr Gamble, Mr Gillard, Mrs Hack, Mr Harrison, Dr Hill, Mr Hunt, Mr Jennings, Mr Kaufman, Mr Licorice, Mr Mear, Mr Morgan, Mr Mullaney, Mrs Newton, Mr O'Shea,
Against.
Mr Orson, Mr Osborne, Mr Old, Mrs Page, Mr Payne, Mr Parton, Mr Pearson, Mr Pendleton, Mr Poland, Mrs Posnett, Mrs Radford, Mr Rhodes, Mrs Richards, Mr Richardson, Mrs Richardson, Mr Rushton, Mrs Seaton, Mr Sheehan, Mr Shepherd, Mrs Taylor, Mr Welsh, Mrs A Wright, Mrs M Wright, and Mr Wyatt. Thank you. So 35 against and 18 for.
The motion is defeated. I now move to the original motion, which is the substantive motion of the MTFS.
See if anyone else wants to speak.
Does anybody else want to speak?
Mr Rhodes,
I have-
Mr Rhodes has got a right of reply.
Mr Rhodes, would you like to reply?
Yes, Mr Chairman. Well, we've had an interesting debate. I'd almost forgotten the first part of the debate after that little bit of excitement over the amendment. You know, most of the speeches that I've written notes on from the opposition members have been complaining about the fact that we have austerity and had had austerity for the last number of years. I can understand that. But, and I don't want to labour on it, but of course we know what caused it. Overspending back in the 2000s when there was a Labour government. And it's perfectly true that every Labour government in history has run out of money. I hate to think what a Liberal Democrat government would do. It just does not bear, it's a nightmare.
Sit down, Mr Bill, please. Yeah. Please sit down, Mr Bill.
Cap fix. If the Mr Chairman, what members have not done on the opposition benches, but the members on this side of the chamber have done, is concentrate on the good things which have happened. This council, I won't say alone amongst all the 150 top-tier councils in this country, but very, very nearly alone, has survived these years and survived it well, in that we are not in imminent danger of cutting back to the bare bones, as many are doing. And we've done it with the lowest funded county council in the country and the fourth lowest funded county council of all. Now that is a magnificent achievement. And it's an achievement, by the way, which is not just to members, but it's to our staff and our management. And not least, of course, being our finance staff who've maintained a constant vigilance over the spending. And you'd think that the opposition councillors would praise them, but of course they haven't. But I do, because I'm very, very proud of the fact that we have got this wonderful staff and wonderful management in this county council, and we back them up because we have survived and will continue to survive. And the budget that we have in front of us for the next, and the plan we have in front of us for the next 4 years shows that we will come through this difficulty. Now, it's fair to say that we don't know what fair funding will bring yet. You'd have thought, to listen to Mr. Mullaney, that he'd invented fair funding. And yet I could remember Liberal Democrat members pouring scorn on it when I first brought it up. Labour members did, to be fair, as well. And yet, you know, fair funding was invented here. It was invented here in this council. And we've put forward in this council the proposals on how it should be done. And do you know, the government are actually adopting the principles of our proposals. Now, you'd think that people would be rejoicing that. Well, I rejoice in it, and my friends and colleagues here do rejoice in it. Because it's a magnificent achievement, and this council has led the way. And they don't like it when you tell the truth, do they? They don't like it. They can't stand it.
Can we get to the point?
Mr. Chairman, we have a council that's well managed. It's under financial control. It will survive anything that's thrown at it. And we will not go under, and we will not have to go down to the bare bones. So vote for this budget and vote with pride.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, on the serious note, order, please. On the serious note, we now have to vote on the budget, please. So it's going to be a recorded vote again, and I'll go to Lauren to.
Thank you, Chairman. As before, then a recorded vote now on the motion put by Mr. Rhodes and seconded by Mr. Shepherd. Mr. Barclay, Mr. Bedford, Mr. Bentley, Mr. Bill, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bolter, Mr. Bray, Mr. Brecken, Dr. Bremner, Mrs. Broadley, Mr. Charlesworth, Mr. Coxon, Mr. Crooks, Dr. Einan, Dr. Feltham, Mrs. Fryer, Mr. Galton, Mr. Gamble, Mr. Gillard, Mrs. Hack, Mr. Harrison, Dr. Hill, Mr. Hunt, Mr. Jennings, Mr. Kaufman, Mr. Licorice, Mr. Mia, Mr. Morgan, Mr. Mullaney, Mrs. Newton, Mr. O'Shea,
4,
Mr. Orson, Mr. Osborne, Mr. Old, Mrs. Page, Mr. Payne, Mr. Parton, Mr. Pearson, Mr. Pendleton, Mr. Poland, Mrs. Posnett, Mrs. Radford, Mr. Rhodes, Mrs. Richards, Mr. Richardson, Mrs. Richardson, Mr. Rushton, Mrs. Seaton, Mr. Sheehan, Mr. Shepherd, Mrs. Taylor, Mr. Welsh, Mrs. A. Wright, Mrs. M. Wright, and Mr. Wyatt.
The motion is carried. Thank you. And can we move on to the final item of business today? Agenda item 7, report of the Employment Committee. Mr. Rhodes, please.
I was just going to formally move, which I now do.
Okay. Mrs. Broadley? Mr. Shepherd? Okay. Is it all agreed? Passed. And that concludes the items today. Thank you all for your attendance.